Welcome back to my series on uncommon Tailwind CSS. We're moving right along here, and in this video, I wanted to talk about the apply directive in Tailwind CSS. So if you're just learning Tailwind, that's one of the things that you're going to learn about is the ability to extract CSS classes, the utility classes that are all over your HTML markup. You can extract them into traditional CSS files using this apply method. And you can check out Tailwind's official docs on this under functions and directives. You'll want to learn about using the base components and utilities layers. That's a really important piece. I'll talk about a bit about that in this video. But then you'll also learn about the apply method, where you can take any of the utility classes that you would normally put on HTML and you can pop them into CSS classes. Now, I really want to stress that this needs to be used sparingly, and you almost want to never reach for this this solution, because you can really. This is something that happened to me when I was first learning to use Tailwind CSS. I think it happens to a lot of people coming from traditional CSS to Tailwind. Is that you want to extract things out to CSS files, and maybe you're using even like Sass and like nested CSS classes, and then it just becomes a lot of stuff to maintain in these separate CSS classes. Really defeats the whole purpose of using Tailwind CSS in the first place. In fact, I have another whole video on how to write dry Tailwind CSS, DRY, don't repeat yourself. I have a dedicated video in this series all about that, and there are better options than using this apply and resorting to traditional CSS, such as using partials in Ruby on Rails or other frameworks like Laravel. So I go into that in my other video. But in this video, I do want to talk about the few cases where I actually do use the apply directive, and I do write a little bit of traditional CSS in basically all of my projects. So let's get into that. The three areas that I almost always create some traditional CSS in my Tailwind projects are some base styles, button styles, and form styles or form fields. Let's get into how I actually use these. Starting with the base styles, I'm going to show you an example project here. This is a Rails app. We're not going to talk too much about Rails in this project. So I've got this basic page here, and it's got a bunch of text, starting with an H1 headline, some paragraphs, an H2, a link, and an unordered list and an ordered list. And these lists have indented items in them. Now, we could do a few things to make sure all of this stuff gets styled appropriately. One is to, of course, apply the styling directly on the elements themselves. Another one that's worth considering is Tailwind's official typography plugin. They offer some typography styles sort of like right out of the box that can automatically style all this kind of stuff. I actually usually don't use that because it's a little bit heavy-handed and they make a lot of assumptions that I end up wanting to customize. So I still like to have my own, designer control over the individual styles here. And so that's where I will define some what they call base styles. And when you're using the layer base container here, which is really important that you do. So let me step back. You could just put these styles in a basic CSS file, which I am doing here without using the base container. The reason why you want to use the layer container is so that you can apply these base styles and then you can still apply custom CSS styles to override these in the elements themselves. So in this case, since we're applying styles to base elements, meaning we're not defining custom classes. So in this case, I'm applying some styling to the body tag and some across all of my headlines 1 through 4, and then some overriding on H1 and H2, H3, H4. I'm also applying some link styling. So that's what makes this link use my primary color and my hover color there strong. So I always want to make sure that I have some bold styling in place. And then unordered list and ordered lists, just to make sure that I have my margins aligned as I like them. And I also usually like to define nested lists because that's something that I use a lot in different different, pieces of content. So that's all sort of styled up here. I also might throw in some like code and pre. So, all the base typography styles just get dropped in here so that I don't have to define these custom. I will probably define custom overrides on specific pages, and that's where I'll actually go into, the actual HTML and start to, customize. So I might do something like this: text secondary 500 or 600, and I can, customize the color just like that. So that's the base styles, and that's the first thing that I will do in custom CSS. So I'm going to look at my application Tailwind CSS. This is what it would look like if you're using a Ruby on Rails application with Tailwind. What I'm talking about in this video are these top 3 imports here: base, buttons, and forms. Now, these additional ones are sort of specific to Ruby on Rails. This is where I define some custom styling on the Flash notifications. And then when I install action text, which is like the rich text editor, there's some custom styles that get applied automatically by Rails. So I'm not going to talk about those in this video. What I'm focusing on here are my base, buttons, and forms. And I just showed you the base right here. And that goes in layer base. Okay, so let's talk about buttons. So I'm going to look at my button CSS, and in this one, I'm going to put it inside layer components. The reason I put it in components instead of base is because here we're not actually defining styles for HTML elements. We're defining styles for custom classes. And I like to use btn for button, and then I use btn primary, or button primary, button secondary, button ghost, and then button large and button small. As your project grows, you might add a few more things here. Sometimes I do like a button white or a button outline. I'm not going to add those in just yet because I don't quite need them in this project. These are sort of like my go-to starting point for button styling. So let me show you a little bit on what these look like. So let's go down here and let's add a button. And there we go. This is a button right there. That's my primary button style. It uses my primary color, and it's got a hover state like that. So let's just sort of inspect that a little bit. So in my base button class, I'm assigning the padding. I'm making it rounded, some text styling. I am applying flex so that I can do things like this. I can add like an icon. So let's put this in a span, and let's do something like that. So I've got a little rocket followed by the button. And I can also change the order of that. Sometimes I might do like an arrow, something like that. I'm using the Font Awesome icon library. It makes it nice to just insert these little eye elements. I like that. So, I don't need to do any additional like flex or spacing, but if I do need to, I could still do that. So I can do like space X4, right? And I can just, bump that out a little bit. And that's the advantage of using layers. If I had put this in its own style outside of a layer, then I would not be able to override my styles by adding that basic Tailwind utility class right there. So that's nice. All right, so that's my primary button. Let's go ahead and do a secondary. This is a secondary button. I'm going to switch to light mode to show you what this looks like. So I've got my primary and then my secondary, which is usually like a light gray version of the button. So I always like to have a primary for the primary call to action on any given page, like buy now or take this action. And then the secondary button is used for secondary actions, like usually cancel. I usually do a basic link, but it might be something else. Like instead of the primary, you might have this secondary action that you can do. So that's the secondary. And then we've got the ghost. I don't use this too much. Basically what a ghost style is it doesn't look like a button, but sometimes you still need the same padding so that the spacing, this works well when you're putting them side by side. so that the spacing works well. And sometimes you still want that container for a button, but it shouldn't actually look like a button. And then we can do large buttons. So let's do that. And we still want to give this button primary. Okay, here's our large button. Pretty cool. And we've got a small button as well. And there we go. It's just a little bit smaller. Again, I can still add additional styles to tweak the text size if I want to. Sometimes I'll build this right into my buttons CSS, but I generally like to control the actual text size in the HTML itself, because that's one of those things that I'll probably need to tweak on the fly. And so that's where I like to think about these extracted components as like, what are the styles that I'm almost never going to change? I could pop them here, but if I need to, I can override them somewhere else. And then other really custom styles, those usually go in the HTML itself. But if you're reusing things and you have like large components with multiple elements, like let's say like a card or a menu or things like that, that's where I start to extract those components out into partials in Ruby on Rails or whatever framework that you're using. All right, so that's buttons. Let's talk about forms. So I'm going to go back into my HTML here, and I'm going to uncomment this basic form element that I added. We're going to get rid of those buttons because they're a little bit distracting right now. You know what? I'll actually get rid of all this content to make it nice and clean for us. So we've got a very basic form here. There is no styling applied, just a text input. We've got a selection dropdown, and then a text area, and then a submit button. Doesn't look like much, right? So let's our form styling. Now, forms I put into a file that I called forms.css. And as you can see, I only have one class that I call form control. I think this is from the days of when I used to use Bootstrap, from Twitter, the CSS thing that was very popular before Tailwind became popular. I still like the form control class name, so I use that. Again, I'm putting that inside layer components. This is very important so that we can continue to override the form control class wherever we need to. All right, so I use the form control class on most input fields. So let's go back to our form and just add class form control. So we'll just add that to the first input just to see what happens. So what did it do? It made the input expand to the full width of its container. It also gave it some padding, a nice sort of like ring highlighting effect when it's focused, and when I unfocus, it looks like that. So yeah, it's pretty nice. As you can see, there's a whole lot of styling that's going on just in that one class here. I'm setting it block, full width, a little bit of rounding on the corners here. I've got a light and dark mode built in, gray and some like border colors. And then I've got the focused styling here. I'm doing a little bit of playing around with ring instead of border. And then I'm also styling the placeholder text. So Tailwind has a nice placeholder class name that we can use there. So yeah, pretty cool. All right, I'm going to apply the same thing to the select and the text area as well. So the select gets it as well. And, it just adds the same sort of styling, just like that. And let's add it to the text area. Now let's also apply our button styling to the submit button primary. And there we go. Now this form is looking much better. This is what my forms tend to actually look like. There's like this weird spacing thing in there. There are other form fields, of course, like checkboxes and radio buttons and things like that. I do have styling for those, but I don't use a custom class that I extract out to CSS for those. In those cases, I actually do apply the custom CSS or the custom Tailwind CSS right in the element itself. And if it's a Ruby on Rails project, then I actually use my forms component, and each individual form field is extracted out to its own Rails partial. And that's part of the instrumental.dev components library. So when you install that in a Rails app, I give you all of my form styling as well as my button styling and everything else that I do. It's all built into that components product. But yeah, that goes much deeper in terms of styling up, forms with checkboxes and toggle switches and radio buttons and all that, as well as like rich text fields in Rails. But I just wanted to show you that basic form control style class, because that is the one class that I always do extract out to its own CSS file, just like that. Because all of this, it just makes sense to pull it out. In all three of these cases, the base classes, the buttons, and the forms, like why do I extract these out instead of extracting out like other things like cards and menus and links and other stuff? These are just like the most repeatable pieces that I always use. Basic typography classes, buttons, and forms, right? And then we can always build on top of those with partials and other Ruby on Rails specific components, if you will. So that is how I try to keep it minimal on extracting out classes using the apply directive with Tailwind CSS. And so yeah, there you go. That's my latest tip for you when working with Tailwind. Thanks for watching.